Well, it is my distinct privilege to be joined today by Simon Hankinson. He serves as a senior research fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Border and Immigration Center, and he is also author of the brand new book, The 10 Woke Commandments You Must Not Obey. So, Simon, it is great to have you with us. You've been talking about this book for a long time, and so I was so excited to see it's finally in the flesh. It's here. It's arrived.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And yeah, it's quite exciting to see something that you've been working on for 4 years actually appear in physical print.
Very cool. A long time coming. Well, I have to out you right away as a European. So you were born in England. You've spent a lot of your life living in Europe. And I am curious to know, was there a time after you'd moved to the States, were living in America, that you kind of had this revelation of, oh my goodness, so much of what I've seen as far as trends very, very far leftward in Europe, that's now happening in the United States?
Definitely, because I was a foreign service officer for 23 years, and I've probably moved every 3 years in my whole life. I've never lived anywhere longer than about 3 years, except maybe Princeton, New Jersey for a while. And when you come back to a place after taking long breaks, you can really see the changes that you can't necessarily see if you're there day to day.
Yeah.
So I left a Britain that was really at rock bottom. I mean, they had national strikes in the 70s. The government was bankrupt. It was a pretty awful time before Margaret Thatcher turned it around in many respects, economically and in terms of, I think, national, will to survive and continue.
Yeah.
And then I came to an America that was just modern and big and amazing. And over the years, I've noticed that some of the malaise, some of the things that put Britain in that position in the late 70s were happening in the US. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing today is the fruit of some of that thinking and some of those policies from, we think we don't have national health care, but we kind of do by the back door. And I think in terms of wealth transfers, we're second only to France, even though we might think that we're a low tax country.
Yeah. So fascinating. Well, I really appreciate the structure in which you have written this book because it's such an enjoyable read, how you've laid it out, the 10 woke commandments you must not obey. So you're moving through what I would call, kind of the goodie bag of the left. These are their favorite policies, and not even just the left, really the far radical left. And I personally appreciated the fact that you jump in right away with so many critical topics, whether it's border and immigration, how the left is really working to do away with history, the attack on gender. You're really strategically covering all of these bases. One of the things, though, that you touch on early on that I was fascinated by is who has bought in hook, line, and sinker to so much of this ideology. And it spoke to me because you talk about this woke mind virus and how millennial women, more than anyone, has bought into this. Well, speaking as a millennial woman, I was like, it's unfortunate, but I think you're right. How did you kind of come to that conclusion? And why do you think that is, that this is the demographic that is so on board with every far leftist policy?
Well, it certainly wasn't my conclusion. I mean, it's just the facts. If you look at the polls of what younger women in particular believe, they are the base of the Democratic Party, and they are the base of the gender ideology movement and a lot of what we consider the sort of far left in this country. As to why, I think if I'm going to be generous, I would say that women are nice and they want to get along and they want to help people and they're naturally generous and they want to be supportive. And so when young people are in distress, their inclination, whether as moms or as friends, is to be an ally, to help them, to support them. And sometimes that involves doing completely the wrong thing, as opposed to standing up and saying I love you, but. And honestly, there is a historical fact that mass contagion affects younger women in particular in a way that it doesn't affect older women or men. I mean, it can do, but you look at the Salem witch trials and other incidents in history where you've just had pockets of insane behavior that contagiously spreads from person to person. It does tend to happen in groups of teenage and younger adult women.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really, really fascinating. And I resonate with that. It's like, something that I feel like I have watched as a young person of so many, specifically, like you point out, young women kind of getting swept up in the emotion of all of it. And, we have covered border and immigration issues.
Literally.
That's literally, that is your bread and butter. And for the Daily Signal, I report on border and immigration issues. And so we've had the opportunity together we've traveled to Arizona, to California, to Texas, down to the border. And we've seen just firsthand that how bizarre and just insane, really, the border policies were under the previous administration. And, at 3 a.m., people crossing from all over the world our border into this country. And so you start in chapter 1 with that issue of open borders, and that there's this sort of commandment among the left of there shall be no borders. Where does that come from? Where does that viewpoint stem from, this idea of we actually shouldn't have borders?
It's a left-wing idea that has its origins in sort of international socialism and globalism. The idea that you can have a global citizenship and an allegiance to remember the Communist International. The idea wasn't that there would be communist Russia and communist Korea and it was like everybody would join in this one big international, wonderful communist blob with the Soviets, the sort of committees in each locality. So I think it is definitely rooted in left-wing ideology. If you look at the people who oppose borders, they're also people who tend to buy into the whole package of other, anti-capitalist, anti-Western values. And that's, I think, captured, unfortunately, a portion of the Democratic Party. It's not all of them, but it's enough to move the needle. And I think they definitely wore the pants in the Biden administration.
Yeah, they certainly did. Over 10 million people entering our country. And that's something that obviously the Trump administration is working to correct. And you just look at the sheer numbers and the amount of work that it's taking to try and get really just the criminal illegal aliens, not even everybody, but just focused on the criminals. It's a long journey ahead.
And that's the criminals we know about, because we were releasing at one point hundreds of thousands and paroling tens of thousands per month. And they had no idea who they were. They had no background checks, no real identification, no names. So just yesterday, I think there was a truck driver who was let in and released who killed a whole bunch of people. He was stoned or drunk. It's a horrific act, but the guy was utterly unqualified to drive that truck. Now, I bet you if you looked into his background, if we actually knew, what his history was back in the Punjab, where I think he was from, you might have found that he had several DUIs.
Mm-hmm.
He might have had a record of substance abuse. He might have had a criminal record. We didn't know. And if he'd had those records, in America, you've got to show 10 years clean driving before you can get a commercial driver's license. But we were handing them out. California and Washington State and other states are handing out these licenses to drive big rigs to people who are utterly unqualified and whose records they can't see. It's nuts.
Yeah. Now multiple people are dead. Wow. Just tragic. Well, and I think, for so many of these policies that you're touching on, it stems from another chapter and commandment, quote unquote commandment, that you wrote about for the left, which is this kind of reworking of our institutions. And we've obviously seen this in our education system, but it's been so strategic. And in some ways, I do, to an extent, I think conservatives over time should have done a much better job of recognizing how the left was playing the long game in our institutions, whatever it might be. Speak to that, if you would, a little bit, but just the strategy that the left has kind of implemented, because you can't just instantly say, hey, we should have no borders, or hey, men can actually be women. There has to be a slow burn, and I think the institutions play a really big role in that.
Yeah, others who I'm no intellectual. I do my best to try to understand the issues and the whole.
I think you can claim it, Simon.
Well, the point of this book was try to break it down and explain it to people who didn't have time to read, the 30 books that I read, let alone the 130 that guys like Chris Rufo and Mike Gonzalez, who works here and writes about this issue, has written in depth about Antonio Gramsci, the Italian sort of godfather of this long march through the institutions. This idea that in order for the Marxist dream to come true, you had to capture the institutions of the Western democracies because they were powerful bulwarks, whether it's religion, academia, against their ideology. So they said, well, we're going to burrow up. And you've seen that. I mean, you've got the Weather Underground terrorists, people like Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn, who were convicted of, in some cases, murder, bombings, etc., acts of domestic terrorism. A few years later, released from prison, and then they go into these top-rated universities, University of Chicago, Ivy League colleges, and they're professors teaching the next generation. And now, if you look at our universities, I think Harvard has a grand total of 3 out Republicans out of God knows how many hundreds of professors, and the ratio of conservative faculty to liberal progressive faculty is minuscule. It's like 5 to 95 at best. In certain subjects, even in the hard sciences, it's at most 1 to 3.
Yeah.
So they did a great job of taking over not just academia, but K through 12 education. Our teachers unions are hard left. They prove this every day with their DEI programs. The other day, I think the Chicago Teachers Union was praising a murderer who died in Cuba, a terrorist, as a role model for kids. And then they got the professional associations, whether it's all the medical associations, the American Historical Society. I talk about only a few of them here because there's just too many to name. While the rest of us were busy doing our jobs, and probably against the will of a majority of the members who just weren't paying enough attention to what their union was doing.
Yeah, fascinating. Simon, as you're speaking, I'm thinking, I'm gonna throw you a little bit of a curveball, but I'm thinking, I don't know that I know when the moment was for you, or maybe it was a slow burn when you kind of personally decided, I think I'm actually a conservative. Was there a kind of a moment when you realized that?
I don't think it was one day.
Yeah.
30 years ago, I definitely wouldn't have identified myself as a conservative. I wasn't much of a political person, really. I had opinions about various things, but I didn't have a unifying philosophy. So I think that happened kind of in opposition to what was happening. I got the red pill, the red suppository. At some point, you wake up and you think, well, wait a minute, this gender ideology thing is absolutely insane, and I cannot support anyone who is trying to do this to children, and to strip women of these things that they've won over generations of hard fighting. And on the political side, the racial discrimination, I'd grown up thinking that we had vanquished legal discrimination through the Civil Rights Act, and we were moving towards this era that Martin Luther King dreamed of, where we would judge people by the content of their character and their abilities. And instead, we just swapped out one discrimination for another.
Yeah.
So for me, it was these social issues, honestly, more than fiscal issues and foreign policy, where I don't think there's a whole lot of water between the parties, that drove me to being a conservative and willing to speak out about it, because you do that at a cost, as you would know, and anyone who works here understands. These issues are so poisonous, and some people are so angry about them that you can lose your friends, you can lose your family, you can certainly lose your job if you speak the truth or have opinions that are unpopular.
Yeah. Well, and you're certainly not alone. I think specifically on that gender issue, I think so many individuals that used to either not be very interested in politics or even on the left, we've seen this, that they've watched as a whole generation has been lied to and told, hey, maybe you were actually born in the wrong body, and just been absolutely shocked by what we've seen. And, I'm thinking back, I referenced our trips to the border. I'm thinking back to and just driving. Texas is a big state. You end up driving pretty far between meetings. And so we would put on podcasts and then have conversations on those long car trips. And I just remember being struck. I was like, Simon's a border guy, but he always wants to talk about the gender issue. Because you're so passionate about it. And I think there's, in some ways, is a righteous anger of what is happening within our society to the next generation. But it's something that stems way back. And you do a really good job, I think, of outlining that history of, this wasn't just random. It didn't happen overnight. There was a slow burn to get to this place. Maybe explain a little bit of what you discovered about how we got to a place in time where kids are being told in school, you might have been born in the wrong body.
Yeah. And being told that, you've had your gender assigned at birth, and it's really exactly what you feel in yourself that's true. And we should trust 13-year-olds to know what's good for them. Well, I was 13, you were 13, probably more recently. I don't trust 13-year-olds to know which way's up. Yeah, that's just not an age where you're ready to make good decisions. And yeah, I just saw that people's lives were being ruined. And I have friends whose children have gone through this and who've had to make incredibly difficult decisions and were being lied to.
Yeah.
Parents who were really trying to do the best for their kids, but were told by doctors and therapists and teachers things that just simply weren't true. Where it started, I go into the weeds a bit. I read great books by Helen Joyce, wrote one called Trans. Deborah So wrote one called The End of Gender. And Abigail Schreier wrote Irreversible Damage, which, all three make very clear, just factual cases about how this happened. It exploded in young women in particular. The rate went from like 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 50. I mean, you have schools now, I think Portland or Evergreen College, where 50% of the kids identify as some kind of queer, i.e., not straight, different, interesting. What happened was a social contagion, I think, fired up by social media. And instead of the reaction being, okay, you feel that way, let's just see what happens tomorrow. There was this hardcore group of activists, including doctors, including professional associations and people with a lot of money, who urged everyone to affirm instantly this sense. So it's just like that was the gasoline on the fire that fueled this explosion. And I do think it has peaked. I was in London just last week, and there's a professor there, Eric Kaufman, who just published a chart where he'd done some research and shown that the percentage of kids identifying as transgender or non-binary, I think was the category, has just kind of gone straight downhill. And so I do think sanity is returning, but not before an awful lot of damage has been done. And it's still so entrenched in universities and professional associations that I think it's going to be there for years to come. I just read today that I think it's a university in Illinois, Chloe Cole, who you may have met, who is a young woman who was just in brief led down the garden path to believing that she was not a girl and did irreversible things, and then realized that she made a mistake, and has just been trying to explain to other people, maybe young women like her, that they need to be careful and not go down that same path. And this university issued a trigger warning, saying that a transphobe was coming on campus or whatever it was. She's not a transphobe. She's not an anything phobe. She's just a young woman sharing her story, trying to help other people to understand where they are. But that cancel culture that applies in lots of other topics as well is really serious when it comes to gender. And so that's why I try to, the 2 chapters I write about gender, I have a lot of footnotes, and these aren't my conclusions. These are not my facts. These are data-driven arguments that I'm trying to make in a simple way, but just to give people confidence that what they know in their gut to be true is not false. Just because some clown who calls himself an expert tells them it's false, that they're actually right. And there's plenty of good science to back them up, and more coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and speaking of facts and making sure you have things accurate, you have a whole chapter dedicated to the media. I think that's one of my favorite chapters. Is chapter 7. It says, "You shall bear false witness," as commandment number 7, not to obey the woke's commandments. So I found this just fascinating, especially given I think some of the actions we've seen recently. Congress pulling back some funding from NPR, from PBS, really trying to rein in the out of control media. So first off, I'm curious, where do you get your news? But then also, have we maybe moved beyond the days where, the public really does trust the media? We're seeing so many kind of small independent news outlets. Obviously, some people now just go on X to get their news right from the source. Are kind of the big establishment media outlets, are they on their way out? What do you think?
Yeah, I do. And I think they killed themselves. I mean, it might have happened anyway, because as you say, there was this big explosion of content. You've got, X and social media and Instagram and, phone-based sources for snapshot news. You've got the Daily Signal, Daily Caller, the Daily Wire, all the dailies. But just so many conservative outlets that are out there. That are the Washington Free Beacon, which has a great sense of humor. but does really good investigative work. Then you've got people like Lee Fang and Matt Taibbi, independent journalists who are out there. John Solomon doing their own thing, and Megyn Kelly's podcast, which is fantastic. And I just one of the few that I listen to all the time. Here at Heritage, we've got not just the Daily Signal podcast, but I think 3 or 4 others that are covering news topics. So people now have a choice, and I think they don't trust the media writ large. The media that I grew up with was ABC, CBS, NBC, PBS. Then you read the Washington Times or the LA Times, the Chicago Times, wherever you happen to live. There's probably one paper, and then you get a magazine if you're nerdy like The Economist or The Spectator or whatever it is. That's gone. I just don't think. They'll deny it. I read the other day that Barry Weiss, who's from the start of the Free Press, and she's got hired by CBS News, she asked the news staff, why do you think that America thinks you're biased? And instead of saying, interesting question, let's try to look at that.
Yeah.
They were just shocked that anybody could possibly think they were biased because they were so sure that they weren't. And you're like, I read a few things about CBS in here, but all you have to do is just take a look. The late night shows, they were going on about how they're just a bastion of free speech and humor. And I think they probably think they're not biased too. But I read that of the big 5 late night shows, they had, I think it was 29, this is a month ago, so maybe it's gone up, 29 elected Democratic officials as guests, and not one Republican in the same period.
Yeah, it says something.
And that their guests, I think it was 99% of their guests were progressive, liberal, or Democrat, and almost none were conservative.
Wow.
The media has lost America's trust. And for those of us that liked the legacy media and enjoyed getting a newspaper in the mailbox, it's sad to see the great names of the Walter Cronkite and the 1950s and 60s newsreaders that everybody used to look up to. That's no longer a thing. And I think people now have a loyalty maybe to individuals, whether it's a podcast or a channel or a news site, and they have to be much more sophisticated about sifting and triangulating the sources to try to come up with their opinions.
Yeah.
I hope they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we can't cover every single one of the 10 commandments here on the show. That's why people need to just get the book and read it. But among the 10 woke commandments you must not obey, was there one chapter in particular that you just thoroughly enjoyed writing and maybe even found yourself laughing about some of the things you were unearthing?
Well, maybe I think it was chapter 9. You will take no responsibility for your actions.
Oh, yeah.
I was looking into standardized tests, and then I got into the down the rabbit hole of fat studies.
Oh God.
And just the weirdness that surrounds this culture of trying to pretend that it could be perfectly healthy to be morbidly obese. Which is your right as an American to eat yourself to death. To do what you want and go for it, but to then pretend that it's okay and that somebody owes you 3 seats on an airplane. It is amusing as well as weird.
Yeah.
Sad. Like so many of these chapters, they're just rabbit holes that you go down, and the more you read, the more you can't believe what goes on. And so it was hard to keep it to whatever 200 something pages in 10 chapters.
I'm sure. Well, I did appreciate the fact that at the end of every chapter, you kind of give people a little bit of hope and some action steps. I thought that was really unique. You don't see that in many books because it's easy to just sort of say the world is falling apart and this is what the woke left has done. But you're actually saying, hey, we can do something about this. We can educate ourselves more. Explain a little bit why you chose to end each chapter and how you ended each chapter.
I end every chapter with a person to follow. Usually on social media, on X, because that's where I am most of the time, on Twitter, a book to read if you're interested, because my chapter may be 15, 20 pages long, but I got all that information from, 50 books and articles, and an organization that you might want to think about joining or at least looking at.
Yeah.
So if you're a parent who has a child experiencing gender dysphoria, you're not alone. There's the society, I think it's called the Society for Evidence-Based Medicine, Gender Medicine, SAGM. There's advocacy groups for parents who have children in exactly this situation who can help parents understand what's going on and maybe avoid some of the pitfalls and mistakes that people made, 5-10 years ago. Because I want to be optimistic. I'm an American, maybe an immigrant, but I'm an American, and that's what we are, right? We're optimistic people. We believe tomorrow's going to be better. Yeah. We've had our bad times, but we want our children to have a brighter future, or at least a bright future. and the opportunity to succeed and to do well. So I didn't want to be a bummer alone and just say, yeah, America's in a terrible place and, we'll never get out. I wanted to at least highlight people who I had looked up to and followed and learned from, and show that there's lots of people out there like you doing what you do. And if you're interested and you want to pursue it further, you can get involved.
Yeah, love it. What is your number one hope that readers take from the book?
I would hope that it just arms them with some facts and some concise arguments so that when they're buttonholed the next time at the PTA meeting or at the Thanksgiving dinner table by someone who just says something dumb, that they can politely engage and challenge them. Because we've just got to this point where people don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
I went to this thing called the Battle of Ideas in London, where there was the communist Marxist Leninist Party was there. Then there was the GenSpect, which is a gender critical organization. It was everybody welcome, and we just touched on like 50 third rail topics, and everybody was polite. It was fun. It was a really great occasion. I'm not sure it could happen here, but I really admired Charlie Kirk for going out there and debating people on their own terms, on their own turf. He took a lot of heat for it, but whenever I heard him, he was polite. He was a tough debater. I mean, he didn't, lie down and lose, but he didn't shout people down. He listened to what they had to say. He put the opponents in the front row. And it was tragic that we lost him, but I hope we don't lose that goal to try to talk to each other, because we're at a rough spot. We're very polarized, but ultimately we do have more in common than we have apart. We do have a constitution that I think most people believe is a fundamentally excellent document that binds this country of very diverse people together. And we do all want a good future for our children living together in harmony rather than polarized and hating each other.
Yeah. Well, Simon, thank you for kind of writing this practical guide. I feel like it's especially appropriate ahead of the holiday season, as so many of us will.
Stocking stuffer. There you go.
Exactly. A good gift for the family members that maybe think a little differently than you. It is The 10 Woke Commandments You Must Not Obey by Simon Hankinson. Simon, thank you for your time today. Thank you for all the work you've done and for sharing 4 years of your life and thoughts with us here in this book.
Thanks, Virginia. I really appreciate it.
Subscribe to get the news the legacy media won't tell you and only the Daily Signal can bring to you.